So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the NFL recently put out a list ranking and doing the power rankings of every single NFL head coach in the NFL, and the Lions head coach, Dan Campbell, came in at 30th. Dan Campbell was ranked as the third worst head coach in the entirety of the NFL, only ahead of Bears first-time head coach Matt Eberflus, as well as Texans head coach Lovie Smith. Dan Campbell is currently being ranked as the third worst head coach in the NFL and is the odds-on favorite to be the first head coach fired in the 2022 season. And today we are going to talk about the rankings, and we are going to talk about Dan Campbell as a head coach. So with all that being said, let's get straight on into talking about Dan Campbell, the Detroit Lions head coach. Now, Dan Campbell took over a very, very poor roster a season ago. Dan Campbell, going into the season, knew that this team was not going to win a Super Bowl. They knew that this team was not going to win a playoff game, and even a lot of people knew that this team was going to have a top 5 selection. Some people had the Detroit Lions going as far as 0-17, not winning a single game in the 2021 regular season. Not winning a single game within the 2021 regular season. But Dan Campbell didn't let that faze him. Dan Campbell did not let the fact that his roster wasn't very good discourage him or the coaching staff or the players from the fact that they could go out and compete and win some football games. If you want to look at the roster that Dan Campbell inherited from Matt Patricia, it was pretty poor to begin with, and then after they stripped away some of the veterans, some of the larger contracts, and some of the players that just simply weren't in the cards for the 2021 Detroit Lions, this roster was bare-boned, this roster was superstar deprived, and this roster was easily bottom 5 in the NFL. Couple that with the fact that the Lions lost their best player on offense and best player on defense in consecutive weeks, with Frank Ragnow in week 5 and Romeo Okwara in week 4. The odds were not great for Dan Campbell going into his first season. There was a lot of things mounted against him, and there was a ton of things working against Dan Campbell in year 1. Dan Campbell took over a very poor team, took over a very win-starved franchise, and took them to pretty much the best that they could be last season realistically. Dan Campbell and the Detroit Lions had a really, really grueling schedule, having 9 playoff games or 9 games versus teams that ended up in the 2021 NFL playoffs, and the teams that did not make the playoffs that played against the Detroit Lions include the 9-8 Baltimore Ravens, the 9-8 Cleveland Browns, the 8-9 Minnesota Vikings twice, the 7-10 Atlanta Falcons, the 7-10 Denver Broncos, as well as the 7-10 Seattle Seahawks. The only team that the Lions played a season ago that won less than 7 games would be the 6-11 Chicago Bears. They did not play a bad team all season, and they had one of the harder strength of schedules in the entirety of the NFL. You couple a first-year head coach with a bare-bones roster, with one of the worst rosters on paper in the NFL, with one of the hardest schedules in the NFL, and you're not going to get a very good result if you are Dan Campbell. But Dan Campbell did not give up on the season. Dan Campbell by no means let his players give up, and they actually finished the season after their bye week with a 3-3-1 record, which isn't bad at all. Jared Goff in his last 7 games or last 8 games with 3-3-1 as a starter with the Detroit Lions, with wins over the playoff-bound Cardinals, the 8-9 Minnesota Vikings, who were in the wild card at the time that the Lions had played them, as well as the number 1 seeded Green Bay Packers in the NFC North. The other team that they tied was the 7-seeded Steelers that ended up going on to make the playoffs because of their elite defense. The Lions had a grueling schedule, and the Lions had a lot working against them last season, but by the end of the season, they had found their stride, and they were a very competitive football team. I won't go as far as saying they were good. I won't go as far as saying that team, if they were to keep going, would win 7, 8 games in a season or anything like that. But that football team found their stride. They found their footing. They found what worked for them, and they started to win football games. And the ones they didn't win were close as they could be. Now, the NFL, as I said, has come out and ranked Dan Campbell as the 30th overall head coach in the NFL, and I just simply don't see how that could even be possible. Dan Campbell, as I said, with all the odds working against him, took a team that was expected to go 0-17 and took them to a 3-13-1 record. Admittedly, not a great record, but with 2 quality wins over 2 playoff competitors, as well as a tie versus a playoff team, as well as a win versus a borderline wildcard team. He beat 4 playoff caliber teams with one of the worst rosters in the NFL, and by the time Dan Campbell had actually gotten to winning games in Week 13 versus the Minnesota Vikings, his roster was heavily reliant on the offensive side of the ball on Khalif Raymond, who was a free agent signing that was a 5th wide receiver on the roster in Tennessee, Brock Wright, the undrafted free agent tight end, Amon-Ra St. Brown, the 4th round rookie wide receiver from USC, as well as a rotation of Tim Boyle and Jared Goff, 2 quarterbacks that are nowhere near the top of the NFL. On defense, they were relying on Charles Harris, the first-round bust who was on his 4th team in 5 years in the NFL, Jesse Lemonier, an undrafted free agent pass rusher, CJ Moore, a career special teams player, as well as Dean Marlowe, a player that is currently the 3rd safety on the Atlanta Falcons. They were relying on backups, they were relying on undrafted free agents, and they had 2 total starters on both the offense and the defense together make it and start all 17 games in the NFL season. They, for a majority of the season, played backups, rookies, or undrafted free agents against arguably the toughest schedule in the NFL, and they still beat or tied 3 playoff teams a season ago. Now, if you want to look at some of the players, or some of the coaches, I should say, that are ahead of Dan Campbell in the rankings, you are going to find first-time head coaches Kevin O'Connell, Brian Daboll, Nathaniel Hackett, Josh McDaniels, and Mike McDaniels. 5 first-time head coaches are currently being ranked ahead of Dan Campbell. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know how you go about grading head coaches, but for me, if you haven't won a game in the NFL as a head coach, regardless of how hyped up you are, regardless of how good you were as an offensive or defensive coordinator somewhere else, you cannot be ranked ahead of somebody that has won football games in the NFL, especially somebody that has won multiple games versus teams with winning records and teams that went to the playoffs. Now, I'm not saying Dan Campbell should be a top 10 head coach. I'm not saying he should be ranked as a top 15 or even a top 20 head coach. But if you are to go off the logic that a coach that has never won a game in the NFL simply can't be ranked ahead of a coach that has won games within the NFL, that would place Dan Campbell ahead of Kevin O'Connell, Matt Eberflus, Lovie Smith, Brian Daboll, Nathaniel Hackett, Josh McDaniels, and Mike McDaniels. That is 7 coaches behind Dan Campbell that have never won an NFL game as a head coach. That is 7 coaches that have never won an NFL game as the head coach in the NFL. If you want to go a little bit farther down that road, I do think there are a few veteran coaches that Dan Campbell certainly showed more than a season ago. You want to talk about the Carolina Panthers head coach, right? Matt Rule, a team that is pretty talented on paper, a team that has quite a few stars on the defense, especially, as well as one of the better young wide receivers in the NFL. That team started 3-0, finished 5-12. They finished the season 2-12 in a not so stacked division with a not so stacked schedule against them a year ago. The Panthers were one of the biggest underperformers a season ago, and if you give Dan Campbell some of the superstars, some of the talent that the Panthers have on their defense, they would have looked much better. on the Detroit Lions under Dan Campbell. I would argue that guys like Dennis Allen for the Saints, guys like Robert Saleh for the Jets did not vastly outperform or vastly prove that they were better than Dan Campbell a season ago. I think you could argue Robert Saleh is maybe better, right? He got more production, he got more wins. That's a fair argument to make, but at the very least, Dan Campbell is a better head coach right now than Kevin O'Connell, Matt Eberflus, Brian Dable, Nathaniel Hackett, Josh McDaniels, Mike McDaniels, Dennis Allen, as well as Matt Rule. That is 8 head coaches. 8 head coaches in the NFL that either haven't won a game as a head coach or perennially underperform with a far more talented roster than what Dan Campbell had to work with a season ago. Dan Campbell saved the Detroit Lions organization last year. Dan Campbell was the sole reason they even won a game, let alone 3 wins and a tie versus some very, very tough competition. So Dan Campbell is not a top 10 head coach. Dan Campbell, I would even argue, isn't a top 20 head coach in the NFL. But if you're telling me there are 29 head coaches in the NFL, some of whom haven't even won a game yet, that are better than Dan Campbell, then I just don't think that you understand football. But with all that being said, that is all for you guys today. Let me know your opinions down in the comments below. Where would you rank Dan Campbell as a head coach? For me, I would put him somewhere in the mid-20s. I would put him somewhere in the 23 to 25 range. Nowhere near the top end of the head coaching spectrum because admittedly, Dan Campbell has a long way to go. Dan Campbell did have some flaws last year. Dan Campbell did have some things that needed to be improved upon. And Dan Campbell, for what it's worth, only won 3 games last year in a 17-game NFL schedule. But Dan Campbell is nowhere near the bottom of the NFL. Dan Campbell is nowhere near the bottom of the head coach power rankings, and Dan Campbell is far from the 30th best head coach in the NFL. So a lot being said, that is all for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below what you think. But with all that being said, that is all for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.